Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated. Her son takes over.
As he now goes onto the back foot and touches the belt with the cover, and that is stopping first test Henry.
Already tonight, the tensions between the majority Hindus and the Sikh community are spilling over into violence. Buses have been burned and Sikhs attacked, and many have gone into hiding.
Ellison now goes that first ball to Azharuddin, who cuts and gets that single, and that is Azharuddin's 100.
In India, more than 600 people are now known to have been killed by the escape of poison gas, and it's feared the final figure may be over 1,000.
Kapil Dev bowls again to Fowler, and Fowler edges this one, a quick outside edge. It is along the ground to third man, and that is Fowler's double 100.
Gatting raises his bat aloft and acknowledges the cheers of the crowd and their generous cheers. And once again, a nice touch. Amana comes across and shakes hands with Mike Gatting.
Just hours after the England team arrived in India on Wednesday, the 31st of October 1984, the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated, sending the country into riots and ethnic violence. Then, some weeks later, 24 hours before the first test in Bombay, Percy Norris, the UK's Deputy High Commissioner who had just entertained the team at his apartment, was also assassinated. And one of the worst industrial accidents struck in Bhopal. At least 3,800 people were killed and thousands more suffered morbidity and premature death. We're going to hear firsthand what it was like to be in the country at that time, close to these events and involved in the occasional game of cricket across a few months that England toured India in the winter of 1984 and 85. Our journey begins on the 31st of October 1984 when the England team first arrived in India in the early hours of the 31st of October. And it's not long before you discover the assassination of the Prime Minister.
Indeed, yeah. I see from my diary that we touched down at 4:30 in the morning. And, of course, you then get all the garlands and everything else and off to the hotel. So almost dawn by the time we actually got to sleep. And it seemed to be, as soon as I'd shut my eyes, that my phone was ringing, and it was the BBC newsroom in London saying, it's about this Gandhi business. And I said, what Gandhi business? Obviously, because I'd been asleep. And they said, aren't you in Delhi? And I said, yes, of course I am. But so they had to tell me. And unfortunately, the BBC's man in Delhi, who was Mark Tully, of great fame in those days, was out of town following Princess Anne, who was visiting the country, and he was up country somewhere, and so they said, can you get down to the BBC office? And that was where I was for the next few hours, helping Mark Tully's assistant, Satish Jacob, putting endless reports on the Today programme at first, and then on other news programmes.
So you effectively have become the BBC's India correspondent almost in one fell swoop. How did you verify the circumstances?
Well, yeah, it was difficult. I mean, we were operating on. Satish Jacob had a lot of contacts, obviously, and he was getting phone calls in, and we had the telex machine was chattering away as well. That's how we got our news in those days. And eventually, a call came through to Satish from somebody he knew saying, Mrs. Gandhi is dead. And I was conscious of the BBC's dictum that you must always have two independent sources before you announce something like that. And a few minutes later, we got a telex message saying the same thing. So I consulted Satish, who was a bit nervous about announcing it. And I said, well, if these are two reliable sources, I think we can probably go with it. So I rang the news desk in London and said, we're getting the news that Mrs. Gandhi has died. And he said, I was looking for a bit more authority than this. He said, well, if you're happy with that, old boy, go for it. So I announced it, and I was a bit worried later to find that it hadn't been announced in India at all, anywhere.
Well, you went to the hospital, didn't you, where she was being treated?
I did. Well, yes, the instruction came through, one of you stay by the phone and the other one go out on the streets and interview Indian politicians. That was our brief. And they said, you can sort it out between you. Well, Satish wasn't going anywhere. And so I said, I'm afraid I have to tell you that the number of Indian politicians I could recognise by sight has just taken a bit of a bash. And so, anyway, however, I went out and couldn't get anywhere near the Prime Minister's residence, of course. It was all sealed off. So I went to the hospital and walked in amazingly easily and asked if I could speak to any of the doctors who'd been attending to Mrs. Gandhi, and was told that they were still trying to save her life, which was a bit worrying because we'd already put out on the BBC that she was not with us anymore. So anyway, I joined a line of Indian journalists I found outside the front of the hospital, and they sort of alerted me to the various dignitaries who were coming and going. But their feeling was that the announcement was awaiting the return of the Indian president, who was at that time, I think, on a state visit to Yemen. And so they had to wait for him to get back in the country before it was made official.
Now, Prakash, this is your 21st birthday. Amazing to behold. The 31st of October, 1984. Can you tell us a little bit about Indira Gandhi? She was a colossal figure in Indian politics. Can you sort of put her into context for us?
Very happy to. I mean, Mrs. Gandhi, other than the fact that, of course, she was the late Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter, had almost grown up in that political environment post-independence. And from being someone who was infamously once called in Hindi, Mom ki Gudiya, which meant a doll of wax who couldn't speak, she went on, as the world knows now, to be called and compared with Mrs. Thatcher as the, for lack of a better word, the Indian version, if you will, of the Iron Lady. The 1971 war, which was fought on both fronts, the East and the West, the liberation of Bangladesh that followed, the very sort of amazing amount of leadership and qualities that she displayed in finally releasing over 100,000 Pakistani prisoners of war and letting that sort of episode move, if you will, forward and away from being front and center after many, many years. International relations, her famous retort to Henry Kissinger when he tried to push her during the 71 conflict to do A or B, and her comment famously was, well, I don't take orders from any man.
So tell us about your memories of that, because it is your 21st birthday. Presumably you were out and about gallivanting, weren't you?
Yes, well, it's a funny story, actually, on a rather poignant occasion. I actually had a girlfriend who I had kind of thought at the time would be someone that I would consider spending the rest of my life. And I'd actually asked her out on a date, but in the afternoon for lunch, because she came from a fairly conservative family. I don't think her dad was going to let her out in the evening. Remember, this is 1984. And we went out to lunch to a restaurant here in Pune, which is called Quality. Fairly expensive for a student, but I did manage to save up. We ordered, I remember we ordered soup and waited. And the soup arrived and we started and we were chatting and everything was going well. The ball wasn't moving around anyway. It was everything perfectly straightforward. And then suddenly the owner, who was a Sikh gentleman, and this must have been around maybe 1:30 thereabouts in the afternoon, came around to all the folks who were sitting in the dining area and said, "You've got to leave. I'm shutting down." And obviously the question was, why? What happened? And he said, there is news that Mrs. Gandhi has been shot. Mind you, he said she'd been shot. He wasn't saying anything more. And he said, there's the danger of riots. I am going to shut down. And so we all trooped off, having had half a bowl of soup each without having paid for it. But that was the end of it. As you know, Dan, I ended up marrying someone else just as well. But it was a very strange sort of a situation that the city started coming to a grinding halt. We had classmates, two of them I remember in my class, who were Sikhs. And as the news started filtering in of some of the horrible stuff that was happening in Delhi, because the official announcement came out, if I recall right, about 10 to 12 hours after the event. She was shot apparently around 9:30 in the morning, and it was only late at night that the official announcement by the government media started filtering through. But yes, it was, it was a strange day. So many different things were happening around that time. It was a tough period for a lot of people, and it sort of tore apart the fabric of the Hindu and the Sikh, which was something which was never, ever imagined.
Now, Victor, you've arrived in the country. You're not presumably charging around gathering important news reports for the BBC. What are you up to at this stage?
Well, I think I remember us getting up probably mid-morning because we had that 4:30 arrival, all bleary-eyed, thinking, well, we'll tuck into our nice Taj breakfast. And then somewhere else in the restaurant, we look at this group of English pressmen, experts on cricket, who were in a very animated huddle, panicking about what to do. And then we soon realised what had happened, and we were kind of looking on as they were trying to turn themselves into sort of foreign correspondents, like Peter had already had to do. So that was our first sort of awareness. And then we would look out. I remember seeing it. She was shot, I think, only about 2 miles from where the hotel was, and there would be fires billowing up, and our imaginations started to sort of wander and think, well, what's going on here? What are we doing here? How long are we going to stay here? It was tough. It was a very young touring party, actually, about a lot of new tourists. So it was a fairly traumatic start for them. I guess we just speculated what's going to happen. Are we going to go home? We couldn't go out of the hotel. We were locked in the hotel for about 4 days, except we had one or two trips to the British High Commission. We actually tried to have a net on a couple of days afterwards on a concrete net and a bit of fielding practice. And all I remember about that is that my first contact with the cricket balls that came towards me in the air was with my eye rather than my hand. So I've got a black eye there.
Well, the British High Commission in Delhi's got really quite wonderful grounds, hasn't it? So was that your sort of refuge? Because I know that the High Commission advice was that you don't leave the hotel or go out into the city, because you're in Delhi here, and that being the capital, that's probably the epicentre of protest and reaction and all sorts.
Yeah, I mean, we still didn't really know what was going on. We were probably watching the television, or people in England probably knew more what was happening than if you were 2 miles away in Delhi. But we couldn't go anywhere except to the British High Commission for one bit of practice, and we went to the bar one night and just had drinks and met a few people and asked them what they thought was going on. And I suppose after about 3 or 4 days, we were starting to get restless. What are we doing here? And we wanted to have a word with the management. Tony Brown was our manager. It wasn't a big number of people managing a tour like that. It was Tony Brown, there was Norman Gifford, our assistant manager, a scorer, and Bernard Thomas, the physio. That was about it. But we started to get a bit restless, and I remember on about 3 or 4 days in, we had this quite stormy meeting. I mean, Tony Brown could be quite a forceful individual.
He's the manager, to be clear.
He's the manager.
He's the team manager.
He's the team manager. We've been stuck in Delhi for 3 or 4 days, not being able to do anything. The cricket is clearly, there's a 12-day period of mourning. We can't. So we're starting to think, well, what's going on? What are we doing just staying here while everything is burning outside? And it was a stormy meeting in which I think dear old Alan Lamb was really quite forceful about, well, we shouldn't be here. Perhaps we should be going home. And Tony Brown, who had charge of all our passports, we'd give them to him as soon as we'd arrived. I remember him brandishing Alan Lamb's passport and saying, well, here it is. If you want it, you can take it and you can, let's say, go home if you want to.
The Indian team were, believe it or not, in the one place that nobody would have wanted them to be, which was in Pakistan. They were playing in a one-day international, mind you, a 40-over game, which was the norm because of the early setting of the sun at that time of the year. And they were playing in Sialkot, which is a border town, not very far at all from the line of control as the international border between India and Pakistan is referred to. And that was another amazing story, really, because as the news came through, and I think it was Mr. Qureshi, who was the deputy commissioner of Sialkot at the time, who was the one tasked with the job of now taking a decision on A, what to do, B, when to inform the Indian captain, who was Sunil Gavaskar, and Raj Singh Dungarpur, who was the manager, and what indeed to do with the crowd, because they feared that obviously if they called off the game, there would actually be serious problems. And so he chose to wait for the first innings to be completed. India had won the toss for batting, and having lost the Test series earlier, and I think it lost the first one-day international as well, there was an opportunity for them here. Vengsarkar, I think it was, who top scored unbeaten. By those day standards, India had got a decent score, 230, 240 odd, which was very, very good at the time. And as the players came off, Gavaskar, who had been informed probably an hour and a half or so before the end of the innings, and who concurred with the Deputy Commissioner of Sialkot that we should not interrupt the innings, then got everyone together. They were told that they were going to be put on a bus and driven off so that they could fly back or drive back, depending on where they wanted to go. There were people in that team, of course, who belonged to Delhi, Madan Lal in particular. And as the news had started filtering in, many of them were very apprehensive. There are reports that Ravi Shastri actually broke down and sobbed, almost inconsolable. Gavaskar was very shaken. Rajbhai, who was a very close connect with the political establishment and the Gandhi family, obviously was very shaken. And once the Indian team had been whisked off and the spectators were still having whatever, a lunch or whatever it was at the time, then the public announcement was made. And this is where the remarkable thing happened, that the crowd, who they expected, the local authorities expected would react negatively, cheered and clapped and happily went away peacefully from the stadium. Obviously, their cheers and claps were driven by the fact that they were very, very unhappy with Mrs. Gandhi. Understandable from their perspective. Being a border town, they would have borne the brunt of the 71 war in many, many different ways. It was only 10, 11 years before that war had happened. And clearly, Qureshi was recognized by the Pakistani authorities as being someone who was very competent and capable. So there was cricket happening, which was stopped. The Indian players came back, and Madan Lal later on actually talked about the fact that he was very, very scared coming back into Delhi because there wasn't a soul at the airport. He had a police escort that was going to take him home, but he wasn't sure because Madanpa used to live in an area which was fairly Sikh dominated, in the sense that there were large Sikh communities around, and already reports of all the horrific things that were happening in Delhi and around the country had started filtering through. So yeah, it must have been a traumatic experience for the Indian cricket team to get back from quote unquote enemy territory 10 years ago to playing a cricket match halfway through and finding their way back to a country that was unfortunately on fire.
So there's turmoil on the streets, and the England team have decided they're going to leave. They're going to go to Sri Lanka. Starting with you, Peter, when did you hear of this decision being taken, and how were you able to follow them out?
Yeah, it was fairly last minute, I think. All sorts of rumours went on, but the offer from the Sri Lankan board had come in, and then it was a case of how to get there. The team were offered a flight in the president's plane, and we were offered a berth on all the press party on a fairly large Airbus, which had been brought in to carry the crew making a television mini-series called Mountbatten, the Last Viceroy. Mountbatten being played by Nicole Williamson, and a splendid Nehru was Ian Richardson. And we went in that plane the day after the funeral, 4th of November. And I remember I remember Ian Richardson sitting there in a white linen suit with a Panama hat, and I seem to remember he had a Malacca cane as well. He just looked the wonderful sort of the Englishman abroad, really. Anyway, we all trooped off to the airport, where the man playing Gandhi, who was a chap called Sam Dasta, had altered his appearance so much from what he normally looked like on his passport in order to play Gandhi. I mean, for a start, he'd lost a lot of weight and taken his hair off. That he was held up at immigration until they realized why he was looking like that, and then he was treated royally and taken off to the superintendent's office for tea and cakes. Meanwhile, the press were lined up for the American director to inspect, as if she was not sure whether she was going to allow them on her plane. Mind you, she took quite a few US dollars off us for the privilege. So, so we arrived We arrived just ahead of a thunderstorm in Colombo.
Well, this is a thing we're going to come back to, but the fact that all the press are together and the England team, although on a different plane, Vic, you and the press sort of get into Sri Lanka around the same sort of time, and before you know it, you're actually playing cricket.
We are. There's a hastily arranged, I think, 3-day game where a young Aravinda de Silva gets hit on the head by Neil Foster and then produces a brilliant 100. And then we also play a 1-day game, and we have a couple of days of practice. I mean, the press, it's an interesting tour, and I'm sure we'll touch on it later, in terms of press-player relationship. It really was an old-style tour. They may have travelled on, they didn't get on the president's plane to Sri Lanka, but throughout that tour, my memory is that, in a way that would never happen now, that the press got into our bus in the mornings once the tour resumed in India, and travelled with us to and from the ground, partly for security reasons, but also it was not a huge press corps, and we were all in such a weird situation that no one could have possibly envisaged, that it kind of brought the press pack, such as they were, and the players together. And there was one other factor that made that possible, that my dear old friend Ian Botham was not on the tour, and there'd been quite a lot of anxiety between press and players on the previous tour following Ian, drugs, sex, rock and roll, all that stuff.
That was to New Zealand, yes, in 83, 4.
Yeah, anyway, so Ian was big news beyond cricket. But there wasn't that pressure on the press corps to have to, follow Ian's every move. I'm not talking about the BBC, of course, but some of the others. So this combination of factors meant that tour was one of the last where you would automatically be staying in the same hotels, you'd be on the same bus, you'd go to the same bar, and a lot of friendships were made. And we were all kind of in it together, and the cricket was important, but suddenly there were other issues about our own safety that were common, and we spent a lot of time with the press in a way that wouldn't happen now.
Well, you mentioned very briefly in passing the one-day international that was played. It's sort of incredible to me that you arrive in Sri Lanka on the 5th of November. They managed to schedule a 3-day game against the board president's 11 from the 7th, 8th and 9th, and then a one-day international on the 10th. There's an enormous deluge. Peter, did you not end up conducting your interview in the changing room?
Yes, when eventually the game was called off, because the ground was underwater, but it wasn't just the ground that was underwater. The England dressing room was underwater. I went in. I mean, that underlines what Victor says, that usually the best place to do an interview with whatever player of the day you were interviewing was actually in the dressing room. And that applied to both teams. I interviewed Sunny Gavaskar more often than not inside the Indian dressing room. We can't imagine that now. You just simply can't imagine knocking on the Indian dressing room and saying, "Excuse me, Virat, do you mind if giving me a 5-minute interview in the dressing room?" Yes, but the players. I remember going into the dressing room, which was literally underwater, and the players were sitting on tables, and Gower said to me, probably the best place to go is the bathroom, which is a little bit drier. So we did our interview then, and there in the bathroom, and thereafter for the rest of the tour, David would also always say to me if we wanted an interview, "Let's find a bathroom."
Now then, you go back to India so soon after, and the dating of this is extraordinary, really. So that one-day international is on the 10th of November. By the 13th, you're in Jaipur and you're already playing. So, Vic, what were the conversations about going back to India? Why did everybody feel that it was okay now?
Well, because we were all so brave. But it was also what we were told to do. Well, I don't remember there being a huge amount of sort of antagonism, a decision to go back. I do remember that feeling that they're very keen in India to have us back, to demonstrate some form of normality had returned. And I also remember the fact that they looked after us. They were very keen to, not exactly pamper us, but make sure everything was okay, and there'd be more security, obviously, than we would have experienced beforehand. But I haven't any memory, partly because it was an odd tour party, this an England tour party, in that There were a lot of fresh tourists. There were a lot of old lags, except for dear old Pat Pocock. But he was never a sort of cynical old pro. He just loved the game, and he would have probably wanted to go back to India for all sorts of reasons. So I don't remember much resistance about the idea of going back to India. We were assured by one and all that, it's no one's got a beef with you, the England touring team. You'll be fine. And we kind of went along with it, I think.
Now we come to Percy Norris, because you go back
Yeah.
to Bombay, and I guess you're familiar with Percy Norris. He's a cricket lover. He loves to host the England team.
We went there. He's a deputy high commissioner in Bombay, and I mean, we all remember going to his flat. In those days, there would be functions, masses of functions.
Yes.
And we didn't mind them mostly because there was not so many alternative modes of entertainment. But there would be lots of functions, and some would go on for hours, and you thought, when are we going to get away from here? But this one, we all remembered. It was quite a small affair in his flat. There are a few old Indian Test cricketers there. But we'd had he obviously knew his cricket too. He was relishing the event. It wasn't sort of a duty call for him. And we all remembered having a really great time. We had a team photo at 9 a.m. And Phil Edmonds was one of the ones who didn't keep time particularly well on that tour. And he was late. And I think Tony Brown was furious, and David Gower wasn't. Even David Gower, who was on time, was not, because they'd already heard the news, but the rest of the players hadn't. So you've got this tour photo, probably taken by Graham Morris, where the tour party are either looking a bit bleary-eyed or extremely grumpy. And it was just after having had that photograph that we got together, and we were told by David or Tony Brown what had happened, which explained why they were looking so wretched. And it was that point we thought, well, we're going home now.
Presumably because that felt so close to home now.
Yeah, and Percy Norris is the British High Commissioner. I mean, he's English, and why was he under threat? Why would this happen to him? And it was a cumulative effect too. We've had what happened at the end of October. Now we've got our Deputy British High Commissioner, who we happen to have got to know the previous evening, has been assassinated. We just assumed that, and I remember huddling around with, again, the press were there, chatting away, what's going to happen, and most people thought, well, we'll be going home now.
So what was it that changed that? Was it the proximity of the first test? Because the first test was due the very next day. So
yeah.
Is that really what sort of forced everyone's hand?
Well, I don't know how the decision was reached, but we were mulling around for 2 or 3 hours, and probably with the press corps, as I say, and then at some point, David Gower and Mike Gatting did a kind of quick tour of the rooms, and to our amazement, he said, "Right, we're going down to nets in about an hour, in preparation for the test. We're going to practice." To which dear old Graham Fowler piped up, "What, target practice?" Because we're taken aback by this. We don't think it's going to happen. We think we're going home. But they were insistent that that's what we're going to do, and it's what we did. To our surprise, really, we thought that would be it as far as this tour was concerned, but the powers that be thought otherwise.
Well, you can't have been in the very best frame of mind for a test match that began the next day, and it didn't go well for England. Laxman Shiva Ramakrishna, when he took 12 wickets in the match on his debut, just 18 years old. England bundled out for 195.
Yeah.
India replied with 465. The game was pretty much gone. Chris Cowdery made a debut, took a wicket, much to the delight of his father, Peter Baxter.
Yes. He came onto Bhopal, and apparently Colin was driving through the streets of Lewisham for some reason, and listening to the radio, and he heard the fact that Gower had brought Cowdery onto bowl, and in his delight he gave a yelp and drove the wrong way down a one-way street. And just as he was explaining to the policeman who'd stopped him what was going on, the policeman was looking very doubtful, the wicket of Kapil Dev fell to Chris Cowdrey, and the policeman and Colin Cowdrey both yelped with delight, and Cowdrey Senior was let off.
Well, it was the seventh of not enough wickets for England as India won the game comfortably. But crucially, in the second innings, England showed some resistance, and Mike Gatting, who had been, I guess, would it be fair to say, Vic, a slightly controversial figure, almost a sort of Zach Crawley-esque figure, insofar as he just couldn't get 100.
Well,
and this was his 54th innings.
Well, I think I saw somewhere that he'd played in 54th innings, so he's probably played about 30 Test matches, and he's averaging 24. But this was a watershed innings for him. It was a brilliant innings in the second. He was a great player of spin, actually. And it was the watershed. And I've always had the theory about Gat, is that he functions better when he's the top man, when he's in charge. And for most of his Test career, he'd never been the top man, because there was always Ian around who would kind of overshadow him. So he couldn't be the top man. But Gower, quite shrewdly, really, A, definitely wanted him on this tour, and B, made him vice-captain, or wanted him as his vice-captain. So Gat suddenly goes from a sort of slightly peripheral, frustrating, exasperating talent to the main man who's going to bat three, who's is the sergeant major to, John Le Mesurier's David Gower. And he's got confidence. And this innings kind of cemented that. And he would, it was a superb innings in very strange circumstances. I mean, going back to Foxy, I remember we got off to quite a good start, actually. We were 46 for no wicket, and Foxy hit a sort of high full toss from Sivarama back to him. And I remember him saying afterwards that, ridiculously, and it sounds ridiculous now, but when he was out, there was just a scintilla of relief that he was no longer exposed in the middle. There was still that unease that he felt that, I'm the English opening batsman out there. I'm quite a prime target. And the other bit about that first day, going back to Graham Morris, is that, and this is true, I think, that he was one of the three snappers on the tour, and he turned up wearing a jacket crammed with all his hardware, as they do. Found a gateman, and his best Irish accent, he said, hello there, I'm from the IRA. Could you tell me where the English dressing room is? And he was politely showed the way, So, anyway.
That's not overly encouraging sign, that.
Well, no.
So India win that game by 8 wickets. And I suppose the fear, from an England point of view, is that they might have been looking at a repeat of their previous series in India, where a 6-match series began with an Indian victory, and then there were 5 pretty boring draws played out. And so England had ceded this advantage. Prakash, from an Indian point of view, on the other hand, utterly cock-a-hoop, getting that early lead and also doing it and uncovering Laxman Shivarama Krishnan, an 18-year-old, taking 12 wickets on debut.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think to win against the England team, which with the kind of performance that Siva had put in, he was an absolute hero. Of course, it was a very different era, as we can all imagine. There wasn't great hype, but we felt that India might actually be able to do a repeat of the previous time England were there. There was a lot of hope, only, of course, to be dashed later on. But the fact is, for those few days, I think cricket once again might have just served as a bit of a distraction from everything else that was still simmering, and the pain and the hurt of what had happened in the aftermath of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination.
On the 3rd of December 1984, the back end of the first Test match, but it's a date remembered for another reason. A chemical leak drifted over the city of Bhopal overnight, and some estimations suggest that at least 15,000 people were killed. Hundreds of thousands more suffered disease or premature death. With everything going on at that point, did the news come out during the Test match, Prakash?
It would have, because while the actual events of that night only now, I think, are really seeing the reality of what had happened there, and how late the information was relayed meant that the loss of life was far greater than it otherwise might have been. But, Bhopal, I don't know, Bhopal is probably as close, and I hope we never get anywhere near it, was as close to an atomic disaster that one could ever have thought of. To have had a factory run and owned by Union Carbide of the US with 49% Indian holdings from state banks and so on, and to have a situation where a repeated occurrence of minor accidents had created a situation which is a tinderbox. It was just waiting to happen. And finally it did on that fateful night. And it remains to this day. You can walk through that area of Bhopal and you will see physical evidence in shapes of people who've been affected, multiple generations, young children, deformities. It's a really, really sad reflection on what industrial malfeasance, neglect could lead to, especially back in the day, and the Indian government's, I must say, inability to prosecute the real people who should have been, because only 8 Indian officials were finally convicted, and every single one, including Warren Anderson, were let go scot-free. It was a different era, it was a different time, and I don't think the Indian authorities had the courage or the ability to do what was right, even though they could have done nothing for all those thousands and thousands of people who were probably affected and scarred for life. It was really a very, very sad day.
I mean, it sort of sounds sort of the equivalent, the Indian version of a Chernobyl disaster, and the effect.
Certainly, probably worse, Dan. Probably worse, because remember, I mean, if anybody ever looked it up, the Bhopal factory, the Union Carbide factory, was right next to the main railway colony. And had it not been, in fact, for some very, very courageous action by a couple of officers of the Indian Railways who managed to move trains away and not have them come in and stop at Bhopal, I dare say the toll would have been much, much higher.
How much were you aware of that, Vic, the Bhopal disaster as it happened? Because, I mean, it's happened on the last day of a test match. Cricketers notoriously are in their own bubbles, but this is yet again something else that's happened on top of the assassination of Gandhi and Percy Norris and everything that's going on.
Well, I guess our heads were spinning, whatever next. But you're right, we are on a cricket tour and we're watching the news and it's a disaster, but we don't sort of think it's going to impact how we're going to go about our business. It's obviously going to have a bigger impact, actually, on our new friends, the press corps, because they're going to have to do some work that is not involved in whether Pat Pocock's getting his left arm right side on as he rolls his off break. So we know it's happening, but we don't think it's going to materially affect how we go about our business, I suppose.
Peter, were you drummed into service again as the BBC foreign correspondent, as you were on the first day that you arrived?
On this occasion, of course, Mark Tully was in command in Delhi. My memory of it is the news sort of, as Prakash has more or less said, it rather trickled through, and the full impact of what had happened took a while to come through, and eventually, I think, I'm not sure it wasn't Patrick Eager. Patrick Eager had gone through and taken some photographs, and he was deeply affected by what had happened and very strong on the subject, to my memory anyway.
Would that not have been very dangerous, Prakash? I mean, the area and the site must have been deeply contaminated.
They were, and luckily, and if we talk about silver linings, right, the air, the way the wind was blowing that night when 40 tons or more of methyl isocyanide was released into the air, actually had ended up taking the gas fumes or the plumes and the cloud away from the main city of Bhopal. It sort of lingered over the railway colony and the immediate vicinity. And those days, people used to live in houses were right next to the factories where they worked in. But it remained dangerous for anyone to go. And if anyone did go there, I know that they were told to ensure that they had either masks, proper gas masks if they could. If not, then to wet towels and make sure their eyes were fully covered, because the first reactions were from the soft membranes where the gas would go through the eyes and then it would sort of percolate into the system and then all hell would break loose. But watering eyes was the first sign that you were beginning to be affected by the gas.
Let's get back to the cricket, because it comes thick and fast. It's an extraordinary tour when you look at the way these matches were arranged. I suppose partly because there were so many that were hastily rearranged following the assassination of Indira Gandhi. But off you go to Delhi. Now, you've got some pretty, I suppose, raw memories of Delhi. It was only 4 or 5 weeks ago that you arrived, and you've only got 2 days off before you start the next test match. It's more berserk the more you look at this itinerary.
Well, I remember that we went to see the pitch, and it was cracked and dry. And I recalled a conversation between John Thickness of the Logistical Standard and Sunil. And Thickness obviously asked him about the wicket, and Sunil said, "Have you seen the Taj Mahal?" "Well, yes," replied Thickness. "Well, if you want to make a return visit, book up on the 4th or 5th day of this test match," he says.
Right.
But he was wrong, of course, because we're still playing on the 5th day.
Well, we'll get to the test match itself, but firstly, I want to come to you, Peter. In going through this itinerary, there are an awful lot of challenges, it seems to me, both logistically to get around India, but also for you to get programmes on air. You're in different stadia, one day after the next. You've barely got time to unpack your stuff in the hotel before you're presumably going and trying to set up the day before a game. It must have been pretty hairy, wasn't it?
Well, yes, often. I mean, I would, and all the lines and things that we'd booked from London, because in those days you didn't just dial up on ISDN. You had to book in advance with British Telecom and the Indian Overseas Communications Service was the place, and there was a big one of these in Bombay and another one in Delhi, and I hadn't had a chance to go and visit the one in Delhi when we were first there for obvious reasons, or indeed to see. I always used to look in on my colleagues in All India Radio. I had some old friends there, and I hadn't had that until just before the Delhi Test match, the chance to get all that sort of thing sorted out. So all these rebooked lines had to be done, and they didn't always go. And on up-country matches, you relied on finding a telephone. There was usually one in the telegraph office, and you relayed to London the number of this phone, and that's how you did your reports, really. It was all pretty unsophisticated and a bit hit and miss. But I remember arriving in at the commentary box in Delhi on the day before the test match, and the engineer held up a wire which had exploded into coloured wires coming out of this huge cable, and he said, it looked like a bunch of flowers as he handed it to me. He said, "This is your line to London."
Did it work?
At that stage, my heart rather sank, I'd have to say, but I think it worked as far as I remember.
I mean, that's one of many challenges that you had to face across the tour. Reading your book, there's a particularly hairy moment in one game when you're climbing 50 feet up an aluminium ladder.
Yeah, well, that was One Day International in Chandigarh, which eventually, because of rain, was reduced to 15 overs a side. But we, the press corps was led to a certain extent by Peter Smith of the Daily Mail, who did the job splendidly. We addressed him as tour leader all the time, and he had insisted everywhere, obviously, that the press box should be as near as possible in a line wicket to wicket. So we arrived, and as you say, very little preparation time. So I think we'd travelled up from Delhi the day before, and we arrived on the morning of the match to find the press box was indeed in line wicket to wicket, right behind the sight screen. You couldn't see a thing. So he pointed out this, and the man shrugged and said, "Well, this is what you asked for." So we relocated to the roof of the pavilion, which was up 3 floors, but the only access was by a twisted aluminium ladder, which was a little bit frightening, because I remember a couple of our numbers, some of whom are still around, saying they weren't going to do that ladder. And yet there was a splendid bearer who came up with an enormous tray of tea for everyone. in one hand while he climbed this ladder, and I thought, well, if he can do that, doing that, I don't think any of us can complain, really. My problem was that I had to come down it every half hour to report for Radio 2, it would have been in those days, from the telephone in the Secretary's office.
There's also another detail that I think is so hard for people now to understand, indeed hard for me to understand, but you would have to book your telephone calls.
Yes.
So, I mean, how did that work?
Well, if you were in an hotel, you did it with the hotel, the man in the hotel. Only two places in India at that stage that we could do direct dial to London, and that was Bombay and Delhi, and nowhere else. So they were all and you went to the hotel switchboard and you said, I want to book a call to London at this time. I can remember arriving, I think it was, we had a one-day international at Cuttack, and we stayed in Bhubaneswar. And as soon as I arrived at the hotel, it was a Saturday, so I meant to be doing something for Sport On 2. And I went straight to the telephone operator and asked, can you book a call to London? And he was terribly pleased. He said, oh, yes, I can do that. He said, I can get it within 12 hours. So I knew at that stage I was going to miss the programme. Well, that was it. We had no mobile phones, and there's no way of telling London, I am struggling with this.
No, absolutely no way to communicate at all. A less diligent man, someone like me, for example, would have seen this as an opportunity just to sit back and watch the cricket, Peter. I'm not quite sure why you went to such terrible lengths to do your job.
Yes, he did struggle a bit. I remember the Guwahati up in Assam, where Victor took a lot of wickets on a pitch made up of dry, grey river mud. That every evening in this hotel, which was called the Hotel Bellevue, but all the locals called it the Hotel Bellyview. That there was only one telephone. It was in the manager's office, and I used to sit in reception every evening waiting for London to call through on this thing, and then dismantle the hotel manager's phone to attach crock clips to the terminals inside his precious Bakelite telephone in order to send back interviews and reports from my tape machine. And he watched it all, I think at first with a certain amount of alarm, but eventually he got used to it.
England are 1-0 down, let's not forget. And they go to Delhi. India win the toss, they elect to bat, and Victor, hearts must slightly sink when that happens. You don't want to be losing the toss in India and you're 1-0 down already.
No, and it doesn't look like it's going to misbehave too much, and it's not got much pace. And we are 1-0 down, and we are conscious of what happened to Keith Fletcher's team however many years before, 4 years before. So it's a bad toss to lose, you think? But who knows?
Well, just the bare scores, no one really in the Indian side gets going. There's a 60 from Kapil Dev, but everyone else is getting into the sort of late 20s. So it's clearly a pitch that people could bat on. 4 wickets for Richard Ellison, a couple of wickets for Edmonds, 3 wickets for Pocock. Edmonds, the left-arm spinner, Pocock, the off-spinner. And then England in reply to 307, and this is going to be a really crucial moment in the whole series. They come good. Let's make no bones about it. And Tim Robinson has his sort of breakthrough innings, doesn't he? Striking 160, bats forever, gets England into a first innings lead.
Clapping again as Shivarama comes into bowl. A chop shot by Robinson. Shastri fields, throws, Downton's in, and Robinson has his maiden Test century with a delicate dab behind square on the offside. His hat falls off as he runs. He is now hatless. Congratulations from the Indian players who passed him, put a hand on his back. Paul Downton is up with him, shaking his hand, and no doubt renewing the pledge that they must bat together now to get England up to India's score. So it's 247 for 5, and Tim Robinson has reached the magic 3 figures, 100 not out.
Well, it was a sort of horses for courses pick, because Robinson, I think by then, was opening the batting for Nottinghamshire with Chris Broad. And Broad had done really well, but Broad was renowned as being not a particularly deft player of spin. So they picked Robinson, whose record may not have been as good, but was more capable of playing on slow, low tracks with the ball turning sometimes, although it didn't turn prodigiously in this series, and certainly not in this match, I don't think. But he just, as we will learn later, he just kept on batting. Very calm, very measured, but able to square the wicket. It was another watershed innings. If Gatting had played his watershed innings in Mumbai, then Robinson certainly played his in the second Test match at Delhi. 160 about.
There is one other thing, Dan, that why you say people were worried that the same thing might happen to Keith Fletcher. There's one other reason why it couldn't, and that was they had introduced the minimum number of overs in a day's play, which hadn't been the case on Fletcher's tour.
And it was limited to 80, so presumably each day wasn't a 6-hour day.
I think it was 5.5-hour days.
I mean, that's still quite a slow over rate, isn't it? When you've got spinners at both ends, and we still complain now about 90 overs in a day, but 80 overs in 5.5 hours. But what you're saying...
I think on that Fletcher tour it got down to about 11 overs per hour, and then...
normally.
You were there. Were you there on that one, Peter? I don't know. Anyway, it was really funereally slow, and they were trying to do something about that.
Well, that plays to England's advantages. Prakash, your memories of this Test match, because England have got themselves a lead now of 111, but India, they're pretty well placed at the end of the fourth day to draw the game on a pitch that's not got too many demons in it. Laxman Sivaramakrishna's continuing to weave his web over England, despite that total of 418. He picks up another 6 wickets. He's got 18 in 3 innings. And really, if India bat out just, a session and a half, maybe 2 sessions on the 5th day with plenty of wickets in hand, Sunil Gavaskar at the crease, then India can get out of Delhi and still 1-0 up.
Very true. And I think if, again, from memory, I think 4 or 5 wickets down, couple of 100 runs on the board, things looked quite all right. Till, I think India might have lost 5 odd for 20 or 22, something like that, in that Test match. And it all began, while people will have different theories, it all began with Kapil Dev playing that shot which ended up in Alan Lamb's hands. And I remember that there was somehow, from very faint memory, reading in the Times of India, I think it might have been K.N. Prabhu or someone who'd written, that's where the controversy began, that Kapil had played a shot which simply wasn't called for, knowing that India could have left Delhi with that 1-0 lead. It's another matter that England took 4 more wickets to ensure that they sort of restricted India to 235. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that it was started in a press article, and then that went on for other stuff, of course, which we'll talk about.
Well, he was called long off, I think.
Hadn't he hit the ball before?
Yeah, I think he had.
He'd hit 1 for 6. Yeah. He just thought he'd go again.
Yeah. I remember lunchtime, actually. I've got it here. India were 95 ahead with 5 wickets remaining, and they hadn't lost a wicket for some time. And they were grumpy at lunchtime, because I would be obviously in the dressing room getting their lunch ready. And they were grumpy because they thought they'd got a bad decision or something, and they were a bit down. And my recollection is that Gower, we all know dear David, who is the most laid-back man of all, actually got quite angry because he sensed that there was a sort of element of resignation. England had played well to get in this position, but he sensed that they were kind of feeling that the world was against them and that they weren't going to get these 5 wickets, and there was sort of an acceptance that after all that effort, we were just missing out. And he got quite stroppy with everyone and said, come on, we can do this. We can do this. And he had a big choice to make as to whether to take the new ball and bring back the Patesmen or persist with the spinners. And he persisted with the spinners. And Prakash is right. So the Kapil dismissal was key.
India collapsed from 207 for 4. At that point, they have a lead of 96. They lose their last 6 wickets for 28 runs. England find themselves now needing just 127 to win. They've only really got 2 hours to do it in. But I think it's around about this point that we get a debutant in the Test match special commentary box. Peter, do you want to tell us how this came about?
Oh, yes. Well, my summarisers, my expert summarisers for that Test match were Abbas Ali Beg, former India Somerset, indeed,
Oxford
University, and Mike Selvey doing his second Test match with TMS. Well, Abbas told me the night before, the sort of fourth evening, Abbas announces to me that he has to go to a wedding in Bombay. This is sort of rather sprung on me, so this is difficult. I said to Selv, you're going to have to work fairly hard tomorrow. Anyway, as it turned out, fairly early in the day, it became obvious that Selv had succumbed to the affliction that does tend to get Englishmen in India occasionally, and was rushing off to get a fast rickshaw back to his hotel. And I suddenly had no expert summarisers, and the Test match is just getting interesting. And so I went down to the England dressing room door and knocked and asked to see Tony Brown, the manager. And I said, I suppose you could spare someone to come and join and help out in the commentary box. And he looked round the dressing room and he said, obviously Victor had finished his getting lunch duties, and he said, Victor's not doing anything, he can come. And a debut was indeed made.
Yeah, I mean, my memory is more or less the same. You come in, he said, I haven't got a summariser. Anyone will do.
Was there panic? Was there panic in this voice?
In Peter's voice?
Yes.
Yeah, probably. It's been known, just occasionally.
So he's not exactly plucking you specifically for the role, is he? But I
think my main virtue is my obvious availability.
and Peter, does he take to this like a duck to water?
Well, he does. The thing I remember was reflecting on it afterwards is that the world had, for the first time, widely heard that wonderful chuckle.
Well, I loved it, of course. But
well, particularly, he was getting frightfully excited as the wickets tumbled, and then the runs were knocked off.
Yeah. I mean, Foxy was on his sickbed and had to come from the hotel to open the batting. He hadn't been fielding, I think, but and then I remember sitting alongside Tony Lewis was
Tony
working
Lewis
for
was
TMS,
commentating, yes, and
Mike Carey, I remember.
Mike Carey and Ashish Rai.
Right, yeah. Well, it was the highlight of my day, really.
Yeah. Well,
and from there began a beautiful relationship with the programme. Peter, he wasn't your only find, was he? I mean, on this tour, there are a few people that are going to become really rather important to Test Match Special over the next few years, and it might be the appropriate time to bring one of those people in, because with England now at 1-1, the series level. The party go off to where do they go up to? Miles away, Guwahati,
Assam, yes.
into Assam just before Christmas, the 19th, 20th, and 21st of December.
It was like the cavalry's coming.
It does well. I mean, because Paul Allott was injured, was he not? And so England needed a replacement fast bowler, and who better than a callow young man who had made his debut against the West Indies in a 5-0 thrashing the previous summer, than the man who would go on to become, well, I suppose the longest-serving lead commentator on Test Match Special, Jonathan Agnew. Jonathan.
Yes, happy memories being shared, aren't there? It's nice. It's an interesting listen.
So, England are 1-1. The whole touring party's up in Guwahati, apart from Pat Pocock. Where have you been up to this point? Have you been following the series at all?
No, not at all. I mean, you couldn't really. I mean, you could read it in the newspapers, but no. I was officially a reserve, which in those days didn't really mean very much. I mean, they're far more monitored these days. But then, no, I was actually making windows in a wooden window factory in Ratby, just outside Leicester. And because those days, of course, there were 6-month contracts, and you had to find work, and I didn't really have any expectation of going on this trip. I was disappointed to have missed out in the first place, but that's by the by. And so, no, I remember, I think there was a bit of interest building up back at home about Paul Allott and his back. And all I had done really, because there were no indoor nets, I mean, Grace Road wasn't functioning in December. The nets would go up sometime in the spring. So there was nowhere to bowl. You could have a bit of a jog around the streets of Glenfield in Leicester on wintry nights, but apart from that, there's nothing. And so suddenly to get the call up and say you're going to India tomorrow, was a bit of a shock. So I'd never been there before. And they had left, you're quite right, they'd left Pat Pocock behind for me. I remember going to Lord's and sort of picking up bits of kit, a touring sweater. I think I might have got a cap. I certainly didn't get a blazer, because I can tell you about that in a second. But it was just all totally rushed. And so next thing I knew, I was on this flight to Calcutta. And there to meet me was dear old Percy, who's become a very good friend since. I think he was quite relieved not to necessarily on the Guwahati trip. And he met me at Calcutta Airport, dum-dum, and away we went into town. And again, there was nothing there. There was no practice facilities, nothing at all. So, and the team weren't there. So Pat and I would go off in the mornings down to this old golf club called Tollygunge, which is still going. I popped in on our last trip. It was a bit decrepit in those days. It was just a golf club, and we would sort of run around and have a few catches, and that was it, because there wasn't anywhere where you could bowl. We just waited for everyone to come back from this sort of mysterious place called Guwahati that I'd never heard of. And I was sort of knocked around the Grand Hotel in Calcutta. It was a bizarre thing. I mean, it's a real. It shines a light into how much more professional things are these days. The fact that the reserve literally could arrive like that with absolutely no preparation when he got there, no expectation of playing. And then suddenly the team arrived. My old friend David Gower, of course, captain from county days. I didn't really know many others. And I remember that was it. I remember David, I don't know if you remember, Victor remembered, had a bit of a meltdown in reception when they arrived. It was like, it was just absolutely rammed full of people. And I do remember the skipper kicking off briefly, which he can do sometimes. And then that was it. And I'm pretty sure I was rooming with Graham Fowler. So I sort of checked in with him. We'd
drawn straws in Guwahati, and poor old Foxy lost.
Yes, he must have done. But he didn't lose, because he stole most of my chocolate that I brought with me right. Over the course of the next few days. We got on very well, because I didn't really know Graham very well, if hardly at all. So and that was the great thing about changing the roomings, wasn't it? You got to know your teammates pretty well. So it was a strange introduction, but. The blazer, you see, they're all smartly kitted out. There's beautiful blazers with the George and the Dragon and all that stuff. And I looked at these very jealously, because I hadn't got anything. I might take my old Leicestershire one out there. But Bernie Thomas, who was the physio and actually did everything, apparently knew a tailor over the road from the Grand. If anyone's been there in those days knows it was an interesting part of Calcutta, shall we say. Some quite temporary structures. But anyway, in one of these was a tailor, and I remember going measured up for this thing. And as is the case in India, it was made surprisingly quickly. But as is not usually the case in India, and I've got a couple of very nice suits on our recent trip to prove it, this was made appallingly badly. His attempt at George and the Dragon, I can't even begin to decipher what that was. It didn't fit. And I was sort of saddled with this thing for the rest of the trip. And we used to have official functions that we'd go to, and there the team were looking immaculate. And I would come shambling in this, well, sort of jacket-looking thing, wrong colour, and it just stood out. But in a way, as you will discover as we carry on, that was my tour, because really I had no part to play other than carrying drinks.
Have you kept the blazer?
No, I think I left it behind there, to be honest.
This is very disappointing.
It's gone well at auction now.
It probably would, actually.
England have found themselves after 3 Test matches, despite losing that first one with a score at 1-1. And Vic, I imagine spirits at this stage are pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, it was a dire game, but having lost that first Test match, knowing what happens in India over the years, if you lose the first one, you could struggle to get 20 wickets. Having won at Delhi, we're right in it. Morale, as you say, is reasonably good. We're enjoying ourselves. It's as I say, it's not a particularly experienced touring side, so we're still sort of lapping up our first experience of India in some ways. So we're not sort of pining to go home and to have some of the luxuries of the Western world. We're enjoying it.
We're going to pick up this story now in Chennai, as is now, but Madras, as was then. The location for the 4th Test, with the series finally poised at 1-1 with 2 to play. Jonathan, you're now part of the party. You've actually played. You did take a fifer.
Yes, the most expensive fifer in the history of cricket, I think, because it was the first time I'd bowled since September or whatever it was. And there was a game in Hyderabad between Calcutta and Madras, and I played in it, and so did Chris Srikanth, who again I saw the other day during the World Cup, who was a bit like a 1980s Bazballer, who just smashed the ball everywhere. It was a surprisingly green pitch. And so I bowled some good balls, I bowled some rubbish, and I got about 5 for 100 off 20 overs, I think.
He used to bat in plimsolls, didn't he?
He did. He was a great man. It was lovely to see him again. And we had a good laugh, actually, about that game. But it was the interesting thing about that was because the pitch in Chennai in those days, unlike today, actually the ball carried, and it actually went through quite nicely for quicker bowlers. And so it was clear there's going to be a bit of a change to the England lineup, and that probably Neil Foster, who I didn't really know, but who I was now rooming with, so again, the changes had happened, was probably going to play. And I'm sure Fozzie won't mind me saying that he was pretty aghast that I come in and get 5 wickets, because suddenly it looked, well, he was certainly concerned that there was a chance that I might play instead of him, which is ridiculous, because I was completely out of, I hadn't had any practice. But I know Fozzie was a little bit anxious about this. And we got to Chennai, and of course I did make the change, and it was an heroic one as far as Neil was concerned. He bowled brilliantly there. It was a perfect pitch for him. Tall, hit the pitch, and as I say, in those days, unlike today, it actually went through very nicely.
Mm-hmm. Well, there were changes for both sides. Foster's going to go on to play an important part in these last 2 matches, but Prakash, for India, after the controversy really of the dreadful performance in Kolkata, where the game limped to a tedious draw, there are 2 very notable inclusions. Srikanth, as Jonathan has just mentioned there, and of course Kapil Dev has come back. So has the Kapil wing won the argument after he was dropped for the Kolkata Test match following his rash shot in Delhi?
Well, I can't imagine that he wouldn't have been brought back into the side. I think Sunny might have had to wear armour in Chennai if he'd or Madras, as it was, as you rightly say. And he went on to get a 50 in that first innings as well, I remember. So he'd sort of shut up his detractors or the anti-Kapil lobby. I don't think it was a question of whether, it was just a question of how quickly he'll be back, because I remember the board president at that time also then coming back and saying that there was no way that Kapil was not going to play. So it's just right that he was back in the squad.
Vic, that first innings, yet again, India are batting first. Not perhaps ideal, but lose wickets really, really quickly to Foster and to Cowans, 45 for 3 at one point.
First ball of a new over from Foster to Amarnath, and he's caught behind an outside edge which left the right-hander, and a marvellous catch taken there by Downton. So Amarnath is out for 78, and India are 155 for 4.
There is a partnership between Amarnath and Azharuddin, who just scores mountains of runs in this series. But
it's 21st century stuff, I can tell you.
Well,
they go at it. I mean, they're scoring very, very quickly. It's a lovely wicket. There's pace in it, and you can play your shots. And they played a lot of shots, but they also kept getting out. And Foster, when it clicks, he just could get a little bit of swing, but he was tall, made it bounce. The Knicks were carrying. It was highly entertaining. I think they were bowled out way before the end of the day, which doesn't usually happen in the first day of a Test match in India in that era.
Well, 67 overs is all they lasted.
Yeah.
And, what strikes me is the extraordinary contrast with the previous game. Did you feel they were sort of on orders to entertain, or what?
I'm not sure anyone tells Sunil Gavaskar what to do too much in India, but I think it had been a dire game in Calcutta, and the selections are interesting. Srikanth is a wonderfully entertaining, unusual, one-off opening batsman who is going to go for it, in a sort of modern way. And the return of Kapil's 53, I don't know how many balls he faced, but I suspect he didn't face many more than 50 for it, and he played some big shots right from the start, as if to say, look, I don't change for anyone. So maybe they had a rethink, and they weren't ahead in the series too. But it was a weird day of Test cricket, given India's reputation at that time of grinding out victories. Perhaps they played with great abandon, and the catches came, and Foster got the wickets.
Well, because they went so quickly, it meant there's plenty of time left in the match, and England capitalised in historic fashion, in actual fact. Two of their top three, Graham Fowler and Mike Gatting, putting on for the second wicket 241, both of them getting double hundreds. The first time for England in Test history that two people had got double hundreds. Vic, Jonathan, your recollections of that partnership, because that's really what gets England into the position from which they can dream of winning the series.
Well, my recollections were of Fisherman's Cove, because Bruce French and I were actually given the day off. It was the one day we were allowed off on the tour, since we had no prospect of playing. We went off to Fisherman's Cove.
Nothing much happened there, did it?
Well, it's about half an hour, maybe an hour's drive away. And it was a bit rough, and Bruce and I went into the water and were swimming around, and there were big waves, and some young lads suddenly came running down the beach shouting. And we thought, what's this? And they were gesturing further up the beach. So we got out, and they're pointing out to sea. And there were a couple of young girls in there who were clearly struggling. And so in we went. We pulled them out, got them back on the shore, and they weren't in great shape, but we sort of did what we had to do. And then bear in mind, very traditional Tamil Nadu. There was a sort of a crowd gathered a bit, and it wasn't hostile, but it was a bit uncomfortable. And so Frenchie and I agreed that we'd just slip away. So they were obviously okay. We got away, and we promised that we weren't going to say a word to anybody. We weren't going to tell the management or just not tell anybody about this. So we got back, and I didn't. I can't remember. I was with Fozzie, wasn't I? And I didn't say anything to him. But next thing, Chris Lander from the Daily Mirror is knocking on the door. Because Bruce French couldn't restrain himself, and he went and told Chris Lander all about it. And it was the front page of the Daily Mirror the next day, which was ridiculous. But the nicest memory for me was actually a woman wrote to me from Tamil Nadu, and I thought I'd lost it, and I found it in an old jacket, not that blazer sadly, but another jacket. It was a really lovely letter. That was my recollection of I'm afraid, dear old Foxy and Gat putting on their heroic partnership.
Meanwhile, I was trotting out at every drinks interval, telling them they were all doing frightfully well. Foxy played with considerable restraint to start with. He had sort of a couple modes of playing, but he was quite a mature cricketer now. He played quite a lot for England, and he bided his time. He didn't play too many exotic shots. He scoring square the wicket, not playing any big shots against the spinners. And then gradually, Seaver in particular sort of started to wonder where another wicket was going to come from. And I always remember, I think it must have been the end of the second day when Foxy would be well into three figures, and he's batted now for a day and a bit, and it got to the end of the day. There's another over to go, perhaps. And Gat might be on strike for the last over, and he hits the ball deep, for an easy single. And he says, no, not running, because he knows that Foxy is pretty exhausted and is batted heroically. Any old pro wants to get away from the strike right at the end of the day to avoid the possibility of getting out. But Gat said, no, you've done your stuff here, Gat. I'll take the last 5 balls. You stay there.
Well, Foxy told me, Vic, and I don't know whether this is natural Foxy hyperbole, but he said that he actually fell asleep standing up at the non-striker's end. We're talking Madras here, Chennai, incredibly hot, incredible humidity. And they basically batted all day. At the end of that second day, England had 293 for 1. Foxy's on 149 not out. And his claim, or his recollection of it, is that he actually dozed off while Gatting played out the last over as a maiden.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah, well, is it possible to fall asleep? I suppose you can fall asleep standing up. Whatever the truth is, it was, there were some scoreboards here that we've never really seen. At one point, England were 419 for 1, 2 double centurions. Foxy, I remember him, as I say, he'd become quite an old pro, really, at the wicket, until later on in the years he hit a few aerial boundaries off the spinners, but he bided his time before he did that. But it would have been hugely sapping. You know what Chennai's like. It's hot. It's pretty humid. And we weren't perhaps quite as fit generally as the modern player, maybe. I don't know, but he was still there.
And Aggers has bumped him off the front page.
Yeah, yeah, but you know, having tried desperately hard not to be there, let's face it.
Now, you mentioned in passing Shiva Ramakrishnan. You'll recall 18 wickets in the first 2 Test matches. Didn't have a great return at Kolkata, but nobody did. At this point, he takes 1 for 145, and in a way, he's never quite the same threat again. And was that the players working him out, or were the services different? Was there a lot of chat about how you handled Shiva Ramakrishnan?
I don't think there was. I mean, I don't think we didn't dissect things quite so minutely then as people do now. I think people got used to him. I mean, wrist spinners are special, and it makes a huge difference whether after a bit of time, you can start to pick the wrong one, the googly. And I'm sure by now Foxy knows which way it's going to spin. And I think they recognised, I mean, it'd been a long series. He'd bowled a lot of overs, and I think Siva was sort of starting to lose that spark. And England knew that you could wait. If you waited long enough, you would get some free runs by that stage. Whereas back in Mumbai, he was fresh, he was new, we didn't quite know what to expect. You sometimes think, well, we'll attack this man to put him out of the game early on because he might be a nervous youngster, but he got through that very easily. Picked up a few cheap wickets along the way, like his very first one when Foxy hit a high full toss back at Mumbai, straight back at him. So I think he'd been worn down. And I do remember actually Norman Gifford, after that Mumbai test, the first test, saying something like, you know, I'm not sure even though he's got all these wickets, I'm not sure he'll last a series. Now, I don't know why. That was being very old pro-ish perhaps, but you're right. I don't think Siva had the same success as he did in the first couple of Test matches again.
Now, you've talked a fair bit about Graham Fowler's double 100 there, but Mike Gatting, who began the tour, listeners to this podcast will remember, in the first Test with his maiden Test 100, has picked up 100 along the way in the one-day international series, and he now gets 207. That partnership taking England way ahead of India. How were the contrast in styles between the two?
Well, I think we sort of took it for granted that Gat was going to get more runs. He was sort of atoning for all those years coming into this tour where he'd massively underperformed as an England player. And it'd been a source of exasperation not only to him but selectors and everyone, because he was obviously one of the best players on the county circuit, but the runs hadn't come. So it was almost like he was sort of voraciously cashing in. And he loved being the kingpin, as I said earlier. He loves being the main man, and he was clearly in that batting lineup. He was the main man. David Gower actually led the side superbly all through the tour, but didn't score many runs at all. Suddenly, he's our main man, and he feeds off that, for want of a better analogy. And so he was brimful of confidence, and he loved playing against spin. So it didn't surprise Foxy. I mean, you know, Foxy was not particularly renowned as a great player, but Foxy, as we all know, was a very sharp thinker, and he sort of analysed how he was going to go about his business. He knew exactly where he was going to score his runs. And probably not quite so sort of violently as Gat, who had more shots available to him. But so he's just growing match by match, Gat.
So half century from Alan Lamb as well, and at the end of the third day, and there's a rest day to come, England are 611. They've got a massive lead, over 300.
We sent in a Nighthawk, actually.
Did you?
Well, Phil Edmonds went in early on probably the third evening then. Because Night Watchman didn't seem quite appropriate because we were in such a good position, but Gower was next. And he'd been in such poor nick by his standards that I don't think he fancied going in for 20 minutes.
In the end, India bowled out for 412. England win comfortably. 35 was their target, and they get there for the loss of just Graham Fowler, who goes for 2.
England are only 2 runs away from an epic victory in this Test match. In fact, Shiva Ramakrishnan is just about to bowl now to Tim Robinson. 31 for 1 is the total as he bowls. Robinson drives out through the covers. It's 4 runs, and England have won this Test match by 9 wickets. And handshakes all round out in the middle from the Indian players. England are now 2-1 up in the series.
Suddenly this series has been turned around. 2-1 up, one test match to play. There's still one-day international series going on. And can I ask you both, Jonathan, how seriously were the one-day internationals taken? Because it seems that all the eyes are on these test matches, and yet there's a one-day sprinkled in between games. You know, and obviously that was the form of the game that the Indians loved so much because they were world champions. They got full stadia for that, not so much for the test matches.
Yeah, well, they were taken very seriously by those of us who were playing, especially people like Victor and I, who weren't doing anything else.
Seriously.
So, I mean, we absolutely, I mean, it was my first one-day international, actually, the one in Nagpur, yeah, I mean, it was just one of those moments, you know. And I remember, I think I got Sunil Gavaskar out quite early. He reminded me the other day. I think we lost that first game, but the one I do remember was the one up in Chandigarh, where it was a very shortened game, wasn't it, Victor? And
yeah, I got picked for my batting.
I think you got picked for your batting. Like a 10-over game.
15
was it? And I remember playing in that. I remember Kapil Dev. Was it off Chris Cowdrey? I think it was an absolute monstrous skyer, million miles up. I thought, oh God! And of course the crowd was going mad. I did manage to cling on to it. But I suppose now we're so used to, red ball players are there, then some go home and white ball players arrive, and there's a very obvious difference between the two series. But in those days, it was just the squad, you know, and people played and people didn't play. I don't think we were given games just for the sake of it, were we, Victor? I don't think it felt quite like that.
I don't think so. Well, no, I certainly wasn't, because I was I was better suited. I used to come in for Percy.
Yes.
Percy played in the test matches, Pat Pocock, and I probably offered a little bit more with the bat than Percy,
yes,
if we're honest.
Yes, you did.
And also, I was more suited to it. So that became that pattern, and I'm sure you played, well, for two reasons. One is it was a good idea, but also I think they wanted to probably not give Foster a too heavy a burden after Madras, because they wanted him for the last test as well. But they were absolutely jam-packed in terms of spectators. I remember at Nagpur, there was a rickety old stand at Nagpur which fell down during the match.
Appalling.
And
people were killed.
Well, I don't know if they were, but there was. They were
ferried away in ambulances.
It was a serious sort of, suddenly a stand no longer there. In Chandigarh, you would never have played normally, but the ground was full from about 9 o'clock in the morning when it was raining, and no one went away, and conditions weren't really fit for first-class cricket, but we played because everyone was hanging on, and I enjoyed your catch, actually, because it went up so long, so far, and I was miles away from wherever you were fielding. So I had a lot of time to sort of anticipate, well, I wonder whether the old boy's going to catch this or not. I don't think I would have been able to catch that. It was off Edmonds, actually. According to this book, yeah. And I thought, I wouldn't like to be under that. And you had so much time to consider all possibilities.
Yes.
And then blow me down, you caught it.
No, that's astonishing. It's my one contribution to the trip, really.
Well, I mean, actually, you do yourself down there, Raggers. You did take 3 for 38 in the fourth one-day international, albeit in a losing cause.
Yes.
You did get Gavaskar, but not early on, because weirdly he was coming in at number 5, which does seem so strange. I mean, that's a whole new world.
Well, the other thing I remember about that is that Gavaskar and Kapil Dev had a significant partnership of about 70 or 80. And my recollection is, although it may be a mischievous one, that obviously this was a big moment for the snappers and everyone else. There's Gavaskar and Kapil Dev after all the hullabaloo. And they made a big thing about having lots of mid-wicket conferences. It looked like they were getting on like a house on fire. But I'm pretty sure when I walked past, they weren't saying a word to one another.
That's about right.
To come to you, Prakash, before we move on to the last test, the one-day international series would have been important, wouldn't it? And that's where we were getting the large crowds for India, because we were slightly skirted over this. 1983... India win that World Cup against the West Indies in amazing fashion, not expected to do so. And then this tour comes up against England, 5 one-day internationals, and they're packed out. The test matches, not so much. So are we starting to see this is really the kind of big rise of Indian one-day cricket?
Well, certainly. I mean, there's no question about it. Why just one-day cricket? I think cricket as a whole. Remember that 83, the cricket board had gone ahead and promised 100,000 rupee prizes for the winning team, and they didn't have money in their bank. They had to get Lata Mangeshkar to do 2 free concerts to raise money. So from all aspects, Indian cricket's revival certainly was the 83 World Cup win. So no surprise really that people now wanted to go and see this format, which otherwise simply wasn't part of India's sort of thinking, if you will. And so crowds were there. The Nagpur stand crash, I remember very, very well, because I had a cousin in that stand. I was born in Nagpur. My mother's family grew up in Nagpur, and he had sustained a very bad fracture on his right leg in that stand collapse. So it's in some ways very personal, that stand collapse, and that led to a lot of improvements in the stands, dare say, not entirely delivered to this day, but some of them certainly have become a lot better. So Nagpur was remembered more for the stand falling down than for the result. And of course, Chandigarh was because Chandigarh, Ayaz Bindra was just coming into his own as a major part of Indian cricket, and so no surprise that the game was played there in spite of conditions not being quite right.
Now, that Chandigarh match, England won it by 7 runs. They completed a 4-1 ODI series win. And now you all make your final journey, or at least your final internal journey, I'm imagining. Victor, Jonathan, you head off to Kanpur for the 5th and final test. It starts on the 31st of January, which is exactly 3 months after you, Victor, had arrived in the country. It would still have been about 6-7 weeks after you arrived, Jonathan. It's a long old tour. How are England keeping this together here, Victor? Because they know they can taste history.
Well, to come back from 1-0 down to 2-1 up was sort of beyond anyone's expectations for a relatively young team. Our expectations in Kanpur, logically, was, well, they're going to make this thing misbehave. They're going to make it turn, surely. They picked an extra spinner, I think. However, to our amazement, certainly after play started, and perhaps beforehand, this wicket was no so-called result wicket. It was dry, flat.
It's a road.
And a road, and which was really puzzled us.
Yes,
and I'm not sure the Indian captain would have been entirely happy with that, but that's what we got. And in a sense, in an era where you could still, get a draw, it was not impossible to sort of bat in such a way that the game lasted more than 5 days. So it was a bit of a bonus to turn up and a surprise that the pitch was not what we would expect in that situation.
We were convinced it was going to be a stitch-up.
Yeah. It wasn't.
No.
There was a rumour going round that the groundsman had had a cousin or someone who was quite a good cricketer, who Sunil had never taken any notice of and never selected, something like that. And this was his vengeance. He was going to produce a flat wicket.
Prakash, is there any truth in that one at all? Or what have you heard? Because it does seem to be kind of strange.
Dan, you have to remember that Kanpur is where Sunny's wife comes from. So yes. Sunil's in-laws are from Kanpur. And I dare say that there might have been just a little bit of truth in that, because very surprising. Remember, this is the Green Park Oval in Kanpur where Jesu Patel famously bowled out the Aussies. And therefore, Kanpur always had the reputation of being a pitch that offered turn and bounce. And to have this kind of a pitch laid out, I remember it wasn't analysed as much as things are today, of course, but certainly there was a lot of talk about what might have caused it. And who knows, maybe the groundsman did get back at Sunil Gavaskar, if indeed there's any truth to be had in that. But certainly in his own sort of in-laws town, to have a pitch made against his wishes, Sunny wouldn't have been pleased with that.
Well, plenty of runs are scored. India batting first yet again, rack up 553. And yet again, Mohammad Azharuddin is now coming in at number 3. Picks up another 100, Vengsakar 137, everyone contributing. A long old time in the field, 2 for Norman Cowans, 3 for Foster, but the spinners are really struggling on this. They made 553, that did put a bit of pressure on England, who at one stage were in more than a spot of bother at 286 for 6. They were some way off avoiding the follow-on, still needing another 60-odd, but then a partnership of 100 between David Gower and Phil Edmonds, who made 49. An uncharacteristically slow 78 from Gower, but a captain's knock at just the right time. Vic, he'd had a fairly lean time of it, but just as you were in sight of victory, but also potential calamity, he manages to turn things round.
Yeah, I mean, he'd underperformed by his standards in the earlier tests. He had a terrific tour as captain. This was his team for the first time, really. He was the one who brought back Phil Edmonds, who, Bob Willis didn't countenance in the team for a long time. And he had a good rapport with Edmonds, who bowled a lot of overs and got enough wickets to win the series. So it was quite fitting that Gower, at the very end, played a pretty un-Gower-like innings, but it got us over the line. Edmonds got runs. Actually, we haven't mentioned Paul Downton. Paul Downton got a lot of runs in that series earlier on, which we haven't really touched on. So that Middlesex pair actually contributed a lot. But it was, I don't suppose David minded too much, because that was an unprecedented victory. No one saw that win coming, especially after the first test in Bombay and all the other problems and issues that arose during that tour. Kind of made it, I'm sure, even for David, without many runs, a real highlight to his career, certainly as England captain. It was the peak of, I think that matches the Ashes win in England in 1985, which was to come the following summer. For a while, this England captaincy wasn't so tricky for David. It just got a little bit trickier later on.
Well, you're right to allude to it. Just to finish off on the details of the match, England, by replying with 417, meant that India just could not force the pace, and England only had to bat out 36 overs in their second innings. They didn't lose a wicket and drew the match comfortably to take the series 2-1.
Gutting goes across to have a word, and everyone seems to be in a state of suspended animation, as if not sure of what the rules and regulations of the series are. But I think, Jack, that they could now go off and leave the game as a draw.
I can't believe that Ramaswamy is unaware of any rule. He's been on top of his job all through, and it's simply a matter of confirming with both England players, which they have done, that at the end of the game the crowd have finally realised it, but I'll say anticlimax it may be to them, but certainly not to any England players or supporters out here now.
You mentioned there that things didn't get easier later. This series, this India tour, this remarkable win, and then that very well-known, famous 3-1 victory in the Ashes in 1985, are sandwiched between, two blackwashes, as they were known. The West Indies in England in 1984 and again in 1985-6. And that was with the South African rebel tourists back in the fold. Amazing to think that Graham Fowler's last test innings are his double 100 and then his 69 in this match. And he's not going to play Test cricket again for England. England do go on to win the Ashes in 85, but with a different side now, with the likes of Graham Gooch back. But it's all going to go horribly wrong when they go out to the West Indies. When you look back on this tour, both you, Vic, and you, Jonathan, this felt like a sort of high watermark, a real hopeful moment for English cricket. But was the sort of spectre of that dominant West Indies team always going to ensure that they'd come unstuck at that point?
Well, it was a completely different proposition playing against the West Indies, and they were by a huge margin the best team in the world. And so it's hard to answer that question beyond that. But things went wrong too when they obviously went to the Caribbean and got absolutely slaughtered, and just about everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And the on that tour, for example, Tony Brown came out, it's a heroic figure as our manager, because he got us to stay there when a lot of us thought we should be going home, and it all worked really well. The chemistry wasn't quite so good when they got to the Caribbean, I think you'll find on that score. I don't know about that. All I do know is that everyone who went on that tour looks back on it, and this includes all the press corps as well, because so many things happened. It was a sort of throwback tour with the relationship between the press and the players. They were all thrown into the same pot. The fact that we all got on really well. There was a lot of, as I say, first-time tourists. So we all remember that tour with an affection, even though many times during it we thought, why the devil aren't we going home?
Well, this is the point. Don't forget, because after this tour, we went to Australia to go and play a series of one-day internationals.
That's right.
I mean, it's absolutely bonkers. The people like you have been away for months, and we got there. The first thing David did was give everyone a week off from memory in Sydney, and every bit of sort of team spirit and the hard work. I mean, everyone was exhausted, even those of us who'd carried the drinks for weeks. You just wanted to get home, and so.
We had to play.
The tour fell apart, and it did fall apart quite spectacularly, to the point that, having beaten India away from home in a Test series and created history, we then, within a few weeks, lost to New South Wales second 11 in Manly. David reversed the batting order. Tony Brown, the manager, completely lost the plot, and it was a bit of a different feeling going back home. But it was a crazy tour, wasn't it? It
was a crazy tour. We were there to celebrate as the Stooges. Really, we were there to celebrate the opening of the Melbourne Lights.
We were. Yes.
It's one of my cricketing triumphs, actually, in that. We ran out onto the. I know. We ran out onto the field at the old MCG. There's one place you don't want to field.
Yeah.
Bay 13? Is it?
Yeah, it's horrible.
And this is for the only time I showed more experience than Aggers. That I sprinted to the, because I knew both of us were sort of guaranteed a sort of third man or long leg slot, one end or the other.
I've never forgiven you for this.
I sprinted to the members' end to patrol the third man area there. And Aggers was down at Bay 13. He dealt with it much better.
Well, all I learned down there was that if an Australian hands you an amber fluid, it's not necessarily a beer, and we'll leave it at that.
Well, as so often happens in English cricket, a great victory, a momentous and historic victory, is soon followed by a reversion to the norm of disappointment and failure.